Part 1. I moved into my uncle's remote cabin for some much-needed solitude. The world had been too much, work stress, my breakup, it felt like everything was falling apart. He said I could stay there for as long as I needed to clear my head. The place was perched on a hill surrounded by thick forest, the nearest town a good 20 miles away. Perfect. The cabin itself was cozy, a wood-burning stove, a single bedroom, and large windows that allowed the daylight to spill in. At night, though, those windows turned into dark mirrors. The trees outside seemed to lean in closer under the moonlight, and when the wind blew, their shadows clawed at the glass like skeletal hands. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine of waking late, brewing coffee, and chopping firewood. Nights were reserved for reading or journaling. I even started to feel something I hadn't felt in months, peace. But then, on the fourth night, things shifted. I was lying in bed, the only sound a gentle crackling of the wood stove. The room was warm, the kind of heat that makes your eyelids heavy. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a faint knock on the front door. My heart stuttered. Who would be here? It was nearly midnight, and I hadn't seen another soul since arriving. I froze, waiting to hear it again, hoping I had imagined it. But no. There it was, 3 deliberate knocks. Soft, but insistent. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the nightstand and crept to the door. My footsteps felt deafening against the wooden floorboards. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my breath fogging the cold air. I hadn't even brought a weapon, just the flashlight. Slowly, I flipped the porch light on and looked out through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, the woods beyond it dark and unmoving. I opened the door a crack, enough to let the beam of my flashlight spill out. The frosty air bit at my skin, but I saw no footprints in the fresh snow leading up to the door. No sign that anyone had been there. I shut the door quickly and locked it, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. But as I climbed back into bed, a sense of unease wrapped itself around me like a too-tight sweater. That was when I heard it, a distant voice drifting from the woods. It was faint, almost melodic, but unmistakably human. My stomach churned as I sat up, ears straining. Was someone calling for help? The voice grew louder, closer, but still, I couldn't make out the words. It was a high, sing-song tone, like a lullaby hummed by someone just slightly out of tune. I didn't dare move. My body felt paralyzed, as if the cabin walls themselves were pressing in on me. Then, as suddenly as it started, the voice stopped. Silence returned, heavy and oppressive. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the world seemed normal again. Sunlight poured through the windows, the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of branches in the breeze. I convinced myself that the knocking and the voice were just a combination of an overactive imagination and the natural noises of the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that haunting melody. I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my mind. With the crisp morning air biting at my cheeks, I circled the cabin and ventured into the surrounding woods, looking for any signs that someone had been near. At first, there was nothing. Just snow-dusted ground and the tangled arms of the trees overhead. But then, about 30 feet from the cabin, I saw it, a set of footprints. They were faint, as if the person had been trying to tread lightly, but they were unmistakable. The prints were small, almost dainty, and led deeper into the woods. I crouched down to study them, my breath fogging in the cold air. The tracks seemed to have been made by bare feet. Who walks barefoot in the snow? I followed the trail, each step feeling heavier as I moved further from the cabin. The forest was unervingly quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the crunch of my boots and the faint echo of my breathing. The tracks led to a clearing where the snow had been disturbed in a strange circular pattern, like someone had been dancing or spinning in place. In the center of the circle lay something that sent a chill through me. It was a bundle of twigs, tied together with frayed red string, placed neatly atop a piece of old, torn fabric. The fabric was faded and filthy, but I could still make out the print of tiny daisies on it, like something you'd find on a child's dress. I didn't want to touch it. Something about it felt wrong, like it radiated a quiet malice. My instincts screamed to leave it where it was, to turn back. But before I could make a decision, a sound made the hairs on my neck stand up, a soft giggle, high and breathy, from the trees behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering, but there was no one there. Just the endless rows of pines, their branches swaying slightly. Then the giggle came again, this time from a different direction, closer. I ran. I didn't stop until I burst out of the tree line and saw the cabin ahead, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. My chest heaved as I stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind me. I locked it and drew the curtains tight, the weight of panic settling over me. For the rest of the day, I tried to distract myself, chopping firewood and forcing down a sandwich I couldn't taste. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching me. That night, I double-checked every lock, left all the lights on, and kept my flashlight within arm's reach. I crawled into bed, exhaustion finally pulling me toward sleep. But then, just as my eyelids started to droop, I heard it again. The knock. 3 soft raps, the same as before. The knocking was louder this time, insistent, as if daring me to open the door. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the flashlight, its weak beam shaking with my trembling hand. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the front door, too afraid to move. Then came the voice again. That eerie, sing-song melody floated through the cabin, but now it wasn't distant, it was right outside. The words were clearer this time, though still nonsensical, like a warped nursery rhyme. A child's voice, soft yet deeply wrong. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My legs felt like lead as I approached the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the porch bathed in the faint glow of the moon. But the voice persisted, now circling the cabin. Something, someone, was out there, moving around the perimeter. The giggle followed, sharp and chilling. Then the worst sound yet, a creak. It was coming from the back door. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't locked. I sprinted toward it, but before I could reach the handle, it flew open with a loud crash. I froze, expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. Instead, the doorway was empty, opening onto the pitch-black woods. The silence was deafening, broken only by my own shaky breathing. Then I noticed it. In the snow just beyond the doorway was another bundle of twigs tied with that same red string. And next to it, a single bare footprint. Fresh. I didn't wait. I grabbed my car keys, shoved on my boots, and ran out the front door, leaving the cabin and everything inside behind. As I sped down the dirt road, my headlights briefly caught movement in the rearview mirror, a pale figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I never went back. My uncle didn't believe me when I told him, and he said the cabin's locks were fine. But the memories still haunt me, the giggle, the knocking, and the figure I can still see if I close my eyes too long. Part 2. When I first moved to the city, I didn't know anyone. Rent was high, and finding a decent place meant living with strangers. After weeks of scrolling through ads, I found one that seemed too good to pass up, a clean 2-bedroom apartment, cheap rent, and close to downtown. The only catch was I'd be sharing it with someone who worked nights and liked their privacy. You'll barely even know I'm there, the ad promised. I met the landlord, signed the lease, and moved in a week later. My roommate wasn't there when I arrived, but their room was shut tight, and I figured they were either asleep or out. I didn't think much of it. People have their quirks, and I wasn't looking to make a new best friend anyway. The apartment was odd, though. The walls were bare, the furniture was sparse, and the windows faced an alley that barely let in any light. It felt lifeless, like a waiting room that someone had just moved into. Still, I tried to make it homey. I hung up a couple of posters, lit some candles, and set up my tiny bookshelf. By the end of the first day, I was exhausted but content. That night, as I lay in bed scrolling on my phone, I heard the first sound. It was faint, just a soft shuffle coming from the other side of the apartment. I froze, straining to listen. It didn't sound like someone walking, more like something being dragged. I reminded myself that I had a roommate, this was their place too, and tried to ignore it. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and job hunting. My roommate and I never crossed paths, though I heard them often enough, the door creaking open late at night, the muffled sound of movement in their room, the occasional clatter of dishes in the sink. It was almost comforting in a way, knowing someone else was there. But then I started noticing little things that didn't make sense. One morning, I woke up to find a dirty plate in the sink, streaked with what looked like old tomato sauce. That wouldn't have been weird, except I hadn't seen a single piece of food in the apartment. No groceries, no snacks, nothing in the fridge but a half-empty bottle of ketchup. Another time, I found the bathroom mirror fogged up, as though someone had just taken a shower, even though the air was cool and the towel rack bone dry. Still, I didn't ask questions. It wasn't my business, I told myself. But the unease grew. The breaking point came a week later. I came home late from a job interview and stepped into the dim apartment. The hallway light flickered as usual, casting long shadows. As I set my bag down and turned toward my room, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The door to my roommate's room was open. It was the first time I'd seen it like that. The inside of the room was dark, but I could make out its sparse layout, a mattress on the floor, a chair in the corner, and a strange shape in the middle of the room, covered by what looked like a heavy black tarp. Before I could think too hard about it, the door creaked as if caught by a breeze and slowly began to shut. I stood there, frozen, watching as it closed with a soft click. I stood there for what felt like minutes, staring at the closed door. My brain was scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it had been the draft. But there was no breeze in the apartment, no open windows, no moving air. And yet, the door had shut as if someone was behind it. I decided to leave it alone. I didn't want to come off as nosy, and honestly, I didn't want to know what was under that tarp. Maybe it was just storage or some kind of project. My roommate had every right to keep to themselves, and I had no reason to pry. But the next few nights made it harder to keep that boundary. It started with the sounds. At first, it was the same soft shuffling I'd heard before, late at night, coming from their room. But now it was louder, more deliberate. It sounded like furniture being dragged or something heavy being pushed across the floor. Once, I even thought I heard faint whispers, too low to make out the words. Then, on the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of my door rattling. It was subtle, like someone was testing the handle from the other side. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The rattling stopped after a moment, and then I heard it, the soft, unmistakable creak of my roommate's door opening. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there in the dark, listening as footsteps shuffled through the apartment. They were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just outside my door. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and I swore I could hear breathing. I wanted to call out, to say something, anything, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. I heard their door creak shut, and the apartment fell silent again. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming, or maybe my roommate just had a weird sleep schedule. But when I went into the bathroom, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The mirror wasn't just fogged up this time, it was smeared, as though someone had dragged their hand across it. And written in the condensation, in jagged letters, was a single word, H.I. I stood frozen in the bathroom doorway, staring at the word on the mirror. It was written high, almost near the top, far above where I would have naturally reached. My pulse pounded in my ears as I wiped the glass clean, erasing the unsettling message. I told myself it was just a prank, though I had no idea how my roommate could have gotten into the bathroom without me hearing. But things were about to get worse. That night, I decided to confront them. I had every right to know what was going on in the place I was paying to live in. After dinner, I waited until I heard their door creak open. The sound of shuffling feet moved toward the kitchen. Gathering my courage, I stepped into the hallway. The figure I saw made me stop in my tracks. My roommate was hunched over the kitchen counter, their back to me. They were tall, taller than I expected, and their clothes hung loosely, almost like they didn't quite fit. The air around them felt heavy, suffocating, and even though I couldn't see their face, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to talk." They froze, their head tilting slightly to the side, as though they were listening. For a moment, I thought they were going to turn around. Instead, they let out a low, raspy chuckle. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more guttural, until it echoed off the kitchen walls. I backed away, heart racing, and locked myself in my room. My hands shook as I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone had no signal. I stared at the screen, cursing, until I noticed something, the shadow under the door. It was moving. The footsteps were back, slow and deliberate, pacing in front of my room. I bit my lip to stop myself from making a sound. After what felt like forever, the shadow stopped moving. The light under my door dimmed, like someone, or something, was standing directly in front of it. I held my breath as a soft knock echoed through the room. Then another. And another. It wasn't loud or frantic. It was calm, rhythmic, and terrifyingly patient. "Let me in," a voice rasped, barely more than a whisper. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The shadow disappeared, the footsteps faded, and the apartment was silent once again. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as dawn broke, I packed my things and left. I never even bothered to get my deposit back. I didn't want to risk coming back for anything. I don't know what my roommate was, but I know one thing, it wasn't human. Part 03. Last summer, I stayed at a friend's lake house while they were away. They insisted I take a break from the city, unplug, unwind, and recharge, as they put it. The place was beautiful, 2 stories, big windows overlooking a crystal-clear lake, and a wraparound deck that begged for lazy mornings with coffee. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my mornings kayaking on the lake, my afternoons reading on the deck, and my evenings enjoying the kind of quiet you only find in the countryside. At night, the stars were so vivid they almost looked fake. I felt like I was in some dreamy postcard. But on the third night, something changed. I was out on the deck, sipping a glass of wine and stargazing, when I heard it for the first time, a faint humming. It was coming from across the lake, soft and melodic, carrying over the water like a lullaby. I assumed it was someone on the far side of the lake, maybe sitting by their campfire and singing to themselves. It wasn't unpleasant, just a little odd. The humming didn't stop, though. Even after I went back inside and locked up for the night, I could still hear it faintly through the windows. It was soft, but it seemed to stretch across the water, like it was following me. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went to bed. But when I woke up at 3 a.m., the humming was still there. It hadn't stopped. By the next morning, I'd almost forgotten about it. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and the quiet returned, making the whole night feel like a strange dream. I chalked it up to tiredness and moved on with my day. That night, though, as the sun sank behind the trees, the humming started again. Only this time, it was louder. It didn't feel like it was coming from across the lake anymore. It felt closer. Like it was moving. I stepped out onto the deck, the wineglass in my hand trembling. The lake was calm, dark, and vast. Nothing moved except for the ripples in the water. But the humming, it was clearer now, more deliberate, as though someone was standing at the shoreline, just out of sight. Then I saw it. A faint ripple breaking the stillness of the lake, slowly but steadily moving toward the house that I froze, the wineglass slipping from my hand and shattering on the deck. The ripple in the water was deliberate, cutting through the otherwise still lake like something, or someone, was swimming toward me. The humming grew louder, clearer now, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like two, maybe three, harmonizing in a slow, eerie tune. My instincts screamed at me to go inside, lock the doors, and shut the curtains. But my legs wouldn't move. I stood rooted to the spot, staring at the ripple as it drew closer and closer to the shoreline. Then, it stopped. The water was still again, but the humming remained. It was coming from somewhere just out of view, near the edge of the deck. Slowly, I backed away, reaching for the sliding glass door. My heart was hammering so loudly in my chest I thought it might drown out the sound, but no, the humming was sharp, penetrating, like it was inside my head. As I shut and locked the door behind me, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there, staring out into the night, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the lake was calm again, the ripples gone, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I turned off the deck lights and went upstairs to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a scared kid. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any sound. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. The humming. It wasn't coming from the lake this time. It was inside the house. My stomach twisted as I sat up, my hands clutching the blanket. The sound was faint, like it was coming from downstairs, floating up the staircase. I told myself I was hearing things, that it was impossible for someone to be in the house. I'd locked all the doors and windows, hadn't I? But then I heard something else, soft, deliberate footsteps creaking on the floorboards below. I sat frozen in bed, every muscle tense, my ears straining to catch the sound again. The humming continued, soft and melodic, winding its way up the staircase like a twisted lullaby. But what terrified me more were the footsteps, slow, deliberate, each creak of the floorboard sending a fresh wave of dread through me. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. I dialed 911 but didn't press call yet. I wanted to be absolutely sure before I got the police involved. My breath hitched as the footsteps stopped, replaced by silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. And then the humming started again, right outside my bedroom door. I bit my lip to keep from crying out. My hand hovered over the lock on the door, but I didn't dare move. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they were just on the other side, humming that strange, haunting tune. And then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so thick it was suffocating. I waited, my heart pounding, but there was no response. Just as I was about to press the call button on my phone, the doorknob twisted. The door didn't open, it was locked, but the knob rattled violently, like someone was trying to force their way in. I couldn't hold back anymore. I screamed, pressing the call button as I scrambled to the far corner of the room. The operator answered, and I choked out my location and what was happening. As I spoke, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and ragged, as I waited for some new terror. The operator assured me that police were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. And then, I heard it. The humming. It was outside again, faint and distant, floating over the lake. I forced myself to peek out the window. The moonlight glinted off the water, and there, at the edge of the lake, stood a figure. They were impossibly tall, their body thin and angular, with limbs that seemed too long for a human. Their face was turned up toward me, though I couldn't make out their features. But what I did see made my blood run cold. There were more of them. 3, maybe 4, standing in a loose circle by the water. All of them were swaying gently, their heads tilted back, humming in unison. The sound of sirens broke the spell. I looked back at the lake, but the figures were gone. The water was still, the shoreline empty. The police searched the area but found no signs of anyone, no footprints, nothing. I left the lake house the next morning. My friend laughed when I told them, saying I must have been imagining things, that the isolation had gotten to me. But I know what I saw, and what I heard. To this day, I can't listen to humming without breaking into a cold sweat.